NASA cut 47 seconds of audio from the Apollo 11 transmission. They have never explained why. The official position is technical interference, static. A gap in the recording that happens to occur precisely when the crew was on the far side of a lunar orbit pass. The one window where ground control loses contact and nobody else is listening. 47 seconds. I have been staring at a file in this archive for the past 2 hours that contains what was in those 47 seconds, and I need to tell you what Neil Armstrong actually said. My name is Captain Arthur Vance, Deep Space Vessel Manticore. The archive partition I opened tonight was not one I have accessed before. It is labeled with a PUASU classification code, the same program that released the first batch of UAP files to the public 11 days ago. The files the Pentagon released publicly were sanitized. Anyone who read the coverage knew it. Unresolved cases, physics-defying behavior, Apollo mission photographs that the government acknowledged exist, but declined to fully describe. What I found tonight is the unsanitized version, and it starts in 1969. Here is what the public record says about Apollo 11's communications blackout. During translunar insertion and early lunar orbit, there are standard communication gaps when the spacecraft passes behind the moon. These are expected, documented, routine. What is not routine is a transmission gap that occurs when the crew is not behind the moon. July 20th, 1969, 8:17 p.m. UTC. The Eagle has not yet landed. Collins is still in Columbia, alone, in lunar orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin are in the descent module, running final checks before powered descent initiation. The official transcript shows normal commons traffic until 8:17 p.m. 43, then a gap. 47 seconds. Then, Houston, we are go for BDI. Just like that. Normal again, as if nothing happened. The archive's copy of the unredacted transmission file is timestamped from a recovery operation. I cannot fully identify. The source designation is a string of characters I do not have a lexicon entry for. But the audio is there. Glynd and I have listened to it 4 times now. Armstrong's voice does not sound frightened. That is the first thing I noticed. And I want to be precise about it, because frightened would be easier to dismiss. He sounds the way a person sounds, and when they are reporting something that they know they need to report accurately, and they are choosing their words very carefully. He says, Houston, we have a structure bearing approximately 270 from current position. Estimated distance 12 to 15 kilometers. It is not a natural formation. Repeat, not natural. It has what appear to be 3 distinct vertical elements. We can see it clearly from here. Aldrin confirms visual. We are not experiencing instrument anomaly. This is a direct visual observation. Please advise. Houston advises in 47 seconds. Then, Houston, we are go for PDI. The response from Houston is not in the recovered file. Whatever they said is not there. But Armstrong's tone going into PDI is different from his tone coming out of it. Flatter, more contained. The specific quality of a voice that has just been told something and is processing it. I need to stop and say something about my own reaction to this. I have been on this vessel long enough that I've stopped being easily rattled. The architects in compartment 00, the cathedral at bearing 274, the DNA report, the temporal mechanics of object 6751. None of it surprised me cleanly by the time I found it. There was always something I would already half processed that made the next thing feel like confirmation rather than revelation. This one rattled me, not because of the structure, not because of what Armstrong saw, because of bearing 270. The cathedral at bearing 274 from my current position has been the fixed point of this mission since I first detected it, the constant, the thing I have been circling. Armstrong's structure was at bearing 270 from lunar orbit in 1969. The angular difference between those two bearings, accounting for the 57 years of orbiting mechanics between his observation and my current position, is within the margin of error of a consistent fixed point location. I ran the calculation 3 times. The structure Armstrong saw from the moon and the cathedral the Manticore has been tracking are either the same object or objects positioned so close to each other that the distinction does not matter. The angular difference between those two bearings, accounting for the 57 years of orbital mechanics between his observation and my current position, is within the margin of error of a consistent fixed point location. I ran the calculation 3 times. The structure Armstrong saw from the moon and the cathedral the Manticore has been tracking are either the same object or objects positioned so close to each other that the distinction does not matter. It has been there since at least 1969, probably longer. Let me sit with what that means for a second. I have spent months on this vessel, treating the cathedral as a mystery specific to this mission. Something I encountered, something that found me, or that I stumbled into by being sent to the wrong coordinates for the wrong reasons. But it was there before this mission existed. Before the program that produced this mission existed. Before the people who designed this mission were born. Neil Armstrong saw it from orbit in 1969, and Houston had 47 seconds worth of response prepared, which means Houston already knew what it was, or at least knew enough to have a protocol for astronauts who reported seeing it. They knew in 1969, maybe before, and they built a cover story, and they maintained it for decades, and they slowly, carefully, in parcels, small enough not to trigger a public reckoning, started releasing fragments of the truth through something called pure swirl, while keeping the audio files and the memo and the debriefing transcripts locked away in a partition I found tonight by following a chain of document cross-references that I do not think I was supposed to be able to follow. Someone in this archive chain wanted someone to find this. I do not know if that someone is me. I do not know if I am the first person who has sat in front of this partition with serif clearance and read these files. But I am the first person who has been sitting 40,000 kilometers from the cathedral at bearing 274 while reading them, and that feels significant in a way I cannot quite articulate, but cannot ignore either. There are partial transcripts from Apollo 14, 15, and 17, not complete recordings. Fragments recovered from different classification sources at different times, assembled into a single folder by someone who clearly understood what they were looking at. Apollo 14 is brief. Edgar Mitchell, February 1971. Single notation in an unofficial mission log. Structure consistent with previous reports. Bearing unchanged. Crew advised per standing protocol. Standing protocol. That phrase is doing a lot of work. There was already a protocol in 1971, which means the 1969 observation had generated paperwork, procedures, a chain of command for handling this specific type of report. 2 years after Armstrong's transmission, the program already had a standing protocol for what to do when astronauts saw the structure. They saw it as a matter of routine. Apollo 15 has something different, not a transmission fragment, but a debriefing note. David Scott, post-mission. Interview conducted at a facility that the archive's header identifies with the same classification code as the Collins Elite dossier. The note is partial, several sections redacted even in this version, but one paragraph survives. Scott says he observed the structure during trans-Earth injection, the return trip. He was looking back at the moon from a distance. He says, "It was lit from the inside." 3 words, no elaboration in the surviving text, just that. It was lit from the inside. I have been sitting with that for an hour. Apollo 17, December 1972. The last crewed mission to the moon, and, according to the archive's notation, the one that generated the most material. Harrison Schmitt was the only trained geologist to walk on the moon. He was also, according to the archive, the member of the crew who spent the most time trying to observe the structure directly. The fragment I have from Apollo 17 is longer than the others, more detailed. Either it was less aggressively redacted, or it came from a different source with different classification priorities. Schmidt's observation notes describe something that is hard to categorize. The structure is not static, not in the way building is static, or a geological formation, or any object that simply sits in a location across time. He describes what he calls a cycling luminescence, a regular pattern of light emission from the interior, on an interval he estimated at roughly 40 to 45 minutes. The archive's notation flags this. The cathedral, the Manticore has been tracking, oscillates on a 44-minute cycle, 40 to 45 minutes, per Schmidt's observation from 1972. 44 minutes, per my instruments in 2026. The interval has not changed in 54 years. Whatever it is, it runs on a schedule. I need to tell you about the cover. Not the cover-up in the general sense, the decades of official denial, the technical interference explanation for the blackout, the unresolved cases language in the publicly released Pursu files. Something more specific. The archive contains a memo. Internal NASA, 1970. 1 year after the Apollo 11 observation. The memo is addressed to a distribution list that includes names I recognize from the Collins Elite dossier, and several I do not. The subject line is Public Narrative, Anomalous Lunar Observations. The memo is short, 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph establishes that multiple crew members across multiple missions have reported consistent visual observations of a non-natural structure at consistent coordinates. The second paragraph establishes that the scientific and intelligence communities have been unable to determine the origin, purpose, or nature of the structure. The third paragraph is the one I keep returning to. It says, given the current state of public readiness for paradigm-altering information and the potential for social destabilization in the context of Cold War tensions and ongoing space program public relations requirements, it is recommended that all crew observations of anomalous structures be classified at the highest available level, and that no public statements be made until the nature of the observations can be adequately contextualized for general consumption. Until the nature of the observations can be adequately contextualized for general consumption. They were going to tell us. That is what that sentence means. Not we never release this information. Not, this will be suppressed permanently. The intention in 1970 was to wait until they understood enough to explain it in a way that would not cause panic. 56 years later, the PRSU program released photos from the Apollo missions with the caption, "Unresolved Cases." They still do not know what it is. They never figured out how to contextualize it, so they released the photographs without the audio, without the transcripts, without Schmidt's 40 to 45-minute interval, without the memo, without the standing protocol that was in place by 1971, without any of what I am reading right now. I want to be precise about what the PRSU release was, not what it was not. The public coverage said, historic transparency, unprecedented release, the government finally showing what it has, what was actually released, photographs with the label unresolved, infrared footage of objects that the accompanying analysis described as displaying anomalous flight characteristics, eyewitness accounts from military personnel, presented without context, without follow-up, without any indication of what happened to those personnel after they filed their reports. It was designed to look like disclosure, while releasing nothing that would require a structural response, because the thing about actual disclosure is that it has consequences. If the government releases audio of Neil Armstrong reporting an unnatural structure at specific lunar coordinates, several things have to happen next. The structure has to be officially acknowledged. Its nature has to be officially engaged with. The 56 years of silence has to be officially explained. Photographs of unresolved phenomena do not require any of that. They just require a statement that says we are being transparent now, and then a news cycle that moves on. A memo I found from 1970 said they were waiting until they could adequately contextualize the information for general consumption. The PRSU release is what adequately contextualized looks like in practice, not the truth, a version of the truth that can be absorbed without demanding a reckoning. The audio file from Armstrong's transmission cannot be absorbed that way. 47 seconds, a specific bearing. It is not a natural formation that demands a reckoning. So it stays in a partition until someone like me stumbles into it at 118 hours in a cold archive bay, while the architects in compartment 000 stand in their pods, and the temperature drops, and the cathedral cycles through its 44-minute interval, right on schedule, same as it has for at least 54 years. Connects everything I have found tonight to this vessel, this crew. I am going to document it carefully because I want to be precise about what I am claiming and what I am inferring. Apollo 17 debriefing material includes a list of personnel who were moved into the classified observation program after the 1972 mission. Scientists, intelligence analysts, one aerospace engineer. The engineer's name is listed with a home institution and a project designation I have not seen elsewhere in the archive. The project designation is a string I recognize. It is the same string that appears in the project tree personnel files, the files that documented the selection of the Manticore's crew. The engineer was one of the people who, after being read into the Apollo observation program in 1973, became part of the infrastructure that eventually produced this mission, this vessel, this crew. I do not know if that is coincidence. I do not know if coincidence is a category that applies to this archive. What I know is that someone decided, 50 years ago, to keep watching the structure, to build programs and vessels and crews for the purpose of getting closer to it. I want to tell you something about the crew of this vessel that I have not fully documented until tonight. The personnel files I found months ago, the ones that connected this crew to the Project Tree cohort, the 1970s generation of children from specific bloodlines. Those files describe the selection criteria in clinical language: vibrational signature, source frequency access, the capacity for non-standard information retrieval. What the files do not explain is why that particular combination of capabilities was considered necessary for a deep space mission to these coordinates. The answer, I think, is the cathedral. The structure does not respond to instruments the way a physical object should. I have documented this. The sensor readings are inconsistent with normal matter. Part of its presence is measurable and part of it is not. Part of it exists in this dimensional layer, and part of it does not. The people who built this mission understood that. They understood it because they had been tracking the structure for 50 years, since Armstrong first reported it. They would send probes. They would send instruments. They would tried every conventional approach to understanding what it was. And at some point, I do not know exactly when, but the Project Tree documentation suggests sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s, they concluded that conventional instruments were not enough, that understanding the structure might require the specific kind of perceiver that Project Tree was trying to find and contain, not a scientist with better equipment. Human mind with a particular kind of access. They did not send this crew to explore. They sent this crew because they thought this crew might be able to perceive what the instruments could not. I have been the instrument. The whole time I have been the instrument. And I do not know if the architects in 00 are the ones who needed an instrument, or the ones who were waiting to see what the instrument found. I do not know if those are different things. The temperature in the archive bay is down another degree. Whatever the architects are doing right now, they are paying close attention. The Manticore was not sent to deep space to explore. It was sent to the coordinates of something they would been tracking since Neil Armstrong said, "It is not a natural formation," and Houston told him something in 47 seconds that made him go quiet and land the Eagle anyway. I am looking at the cathedral at bearing 274 on the passive array right now. 44-minute cycle, right on schedule. It has been running since before I was born, since before my parents were born, since before the Cold War probably, since before recorded history. if the architects are any indication. I have one more thing to document, and then I need to close this session, because the temperature in the archive bay has dropped 4 degrees in the last 20 minutes, and that means the architects are paying attention, and I have learned that when they pay attention, they sometimes act on what they are paying attention to. The 47 seconds. After everything I have found tonight, the structure, the cover, the connection to this crew, the thing I keep returning to is not the revelation. It is the silence after. Armstrong reported what he saw. Houston responded. And then Armstrong said, "We are go for PDI." And they landed, and he walked on the moon, and he came home, and he spent the rest of his life refusing to talk about what he experienced up there. He gave almost no interviews. He was famously private. He turned down money and fame and the kind of cultural lionization that most people in his position would have welcomed. There are people who attribute that to temperament, to modesty. I think he was told something in 47 seconds that he spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how to live with. And I think he never quite managed. I do not blame him. I am 7 months into this mission, and I am not sure I am managing either. Captain Arthur Vance, Deep Space Vessel Manticore. The structure has been there since 1969 at minimum, probably longer. 44-minute cycle, right on schedule, still recording, end of transmission.